Cool. All right, Django authentication. So we're going to be working off of the wine repository again. If you haven't cloned it and forked it already, you can do that. If you want to run through the demo, we do the basic setup, which is your virtual environment setup, installing your requirements, running the database migrations is what that should say, and spinning up your compose, creating your authentication app, and then testing the app using Postman or curl in my case, because it's easier and faster. So a user account is created with a post request. Like this is our flow, basically. We we first have to pass in some default parameters, right? So in our settings, we're going to be specifying what kind of authentication you want to use. So we want to have validation, and we want to ensure that basically we require this authentication before users have access to the resources that require access. And then we decide what kind of authentication method we're going to use. Today, we're just going to use very simple token authentication. So you, as a user, will register a user and password, and you hit an API endpoint, sending in that username and password in the body, and that will send you back a token. With that token, you could pass it into any API endpoint that is behind that requires authentication, and you pass in the token as a header. That token, the validity of that token is checked by the API, and if it is valid, then you get a successful response and you get to see the results. So we will start by going into our settings, and this is where we specify that we want permissions to require authentication. So we could do this the other way around, where we say, no, we don't want authentication, and then we can manually add authentication to different API endpoints. But we're going to start this way with everything requiring authentication. And then we are going to set the authentication method to token authentication. We'll need to add this new REST framework auth token to our installed apps once we've added that code to our settings. And then we create our new app for creating accounts and returning tokens. In the views of that new app, we will be importing some generic stuff. The create API view will allow us to basically create users, passwords. User is going to be like this built-in default, very vanilla Django REST framework method for creating users. And we then also create a serializer, which we're all familiar with, and we'll just make a very basic serializer, so no excessive kind of testing or checks. And then we specify that we will allow any permissions. From there, we want to create our views. So we first define a query set where we pull all the users, and then we call the serializer that we're also going to be writing. And then we set our permission classes to allow any. And then from here, we specify a create action. So we first want to make sure that the serializer returns a valid value. And if that's the case, we can then create a username and a password based on the values that were passed in as the username and password. And in this final line is where the user is being created and added to the database. Our serializer, like I mentioned, is super simple. We just need the most bare bones stuff to get this going. And then we will set up URLs so that we can access our views. We only need two today, which is for signing up and for getting the token once you've signed up. And then we will add the accounts endpoint to our top levels URL.py to make it accessible. And that's about it. Let's switch over to VS Code. Let's see this stuff in our project. So I've already got everything set up here. We have my Docker containers running. I have a server started running. Actually, I did have a server started, but then I stopped it apparently. So I'm going to run Python manage.py run server to spin that back up. Let's double check. We do see that we have something we can see in the browser. And if we go over to accounts, we see we have access to get token and sign up. So if we go to sign up, we see a way for signing up. Let's take a look at our settings first, though. This is these are the settings that we added. And then once you add that, we will be adding the REST framework auth token to the installed apps. And from there, we are done with settings.py. We can then go over to our views.py. This is where we set up our perform create method, which is what allows us to take in the username and password that is passed to the serializer and create a database entry out of it. And then, like I mentioned, we create the URLs that will give us access to this view. And then we also add that URL to the top level, urls.py. Any questions so far? All right. The instructions say to run Postman. If you want to run Postman, you're very well free to do so. I'm just going to show you a few commands using curl, which I think you should be familiar with. You should have already used curl once or twice, if not a lot. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use curl to hit the get token endpoint. Actually, let me backtrack a bit here. I'm going to just show that we could create a user through this UI. So let's say my username is going to be user2, because I already created a user earlier. And my password is going to be simple password because we're just demoing this bare bones authentication method. So I hit post. Looks like this was a successful request. So now with this user name and password, if I were to make a curl command, I'm going to type -X to specify what kind of HTTP request method I want to use. In this case, I want to use post because I'm trying to hit the get token API endpoint that we created, and we defined that as being a post method somewhere. So I'm gonna, after I type in post, I'm gonna pass in the things that are required. In this case, we first need the URL, so HTTP, my local host, which is 127.0.0.1, and then my port number, default port of 8000. And then we set this up to go to accounts/get token, I believe. With my URL, I can now pass in additional data. So -D for data, and this is what goes in to the request body. In this case, I'm going to need a username and password because that's what we wrote our serializer to accept. And it's going to be username equals user2 and password equals password. All right, let's see if this works. it works. I just got a token, which I can now use in a subsequent curl request. So now let's do a different kind of request. We're going to do curl x get, because that's what our view for wines in the database is. So what we're going to try to do now is view any of the wines that we have in the database. So I think that is, well, we know for sure it's going to be 127.0.0.1, 8,000, and I think it's get dash wines. And, or was it just wines? Let me see. Let me go back to my browser. Yeah, it was just wines. Okay. So we're gonna do wines, and now we don't pass in the auth token in the body. We have to pass it in as a header. So instead of dash D, we do a dash capital H. And as the instructions say in the README, it has to be passed in as an authorization header. And the syntax for that, once you've defined authorization as the key, is to have the keyword token followed by the actual token value. So let's see if this works. Ooh, was a successful result, but I don't have anything in my database. I don't actually have any wines, so it returns an empty array. But at least it was a successful result, so got a 200 response, so we know it works. Any questions? Cool.
Yeah, I got one real quick.
Yep.
So your first curl, the post,
Mhm.
if you yeah, right there. So could you explain again why you're posting that? Is the token not already generated, or you have to post um your new username and password to get that token?
We created two separate endpoints, basically. The first endpoint was to create your username and password. So we hit that through the browser. That all that does is it passes in your username and password to the serializer, which then through the views.py is converted into a database entry. And that's the user.objects create user. Once that user is in the database, like let's say I've signed up, you still have to sign in, right? So basically, let's say from the front end, this is where you would create some functionality to say log in and or sorry, we're past the login part. Maybe you set your front end app to automatically log the user in once they've created a username and password. So now we're just trying to hit any regular endpoint that requires login, right? In order to successfully hit that endpoint, we have to pass in a token. Your user may not have that token cached just yet. It really boils down to how you build out your authentication flow, right? If they don't have that token cached in like their local storage or anything, they'll have to retrieve that token first. And that's what this authentication flow is basically. So once we retrieve that authentication token, which can all be done behind the scenes, that can get cached. It could get stored in local storage. It could be stored in a user object, however you want to do it. But we'll need that token in every subsequent request that requires authentication. Otherwise, they'll be denied.
Okay. Yeah, I just every time I see posts, I'm thinking like, okay, I'm adding to the database, but then you're like, oh, well, I already made that username and password. So, but I guess that does make a little more sense. Yeah.
Okay. I believe what's being created here is the token. It's the token has to be generated and then returned to you. And I think that's why it's a push request.
Okay, got it.
I was gonna say too, I can't think of the proper terms for this, but it's It's like the appropriate convention to use post when sending data. So when you're sending data, you should use post or put. You can send data in a GET request, but it's not, it gets attached to the URL. So it would be like inappropriate to do with like user login type stuff. So you should usually see for an auth setup, it should always be a post request. But yeah, I'll have to look at some documents and see if I can get to that. But it has to do with the status codes and stuff too that you were
Yeah,
mentioning.
that's definitely a good point, Phil. And I think that also brings to mind that with a typical GET request, with the data being passed in through the body, well, actually, I'm thinking about like whether that data is exposed or not. In this case, we are passing in the username and password through the body, but
But yeah, from what I understood, it was like if you did something like for like a converter or something for like PK or like an integer, whatever it stores will get stored in that URL link. So that would be like a username or password or something that's being used for that. So I don't think, yeah, you'd want to do it, but I'll have to double check the docs.
right on. But yeah, definitely standard convention is to use post requests when you're sending data and retrieving sensitive data. If there aren't any more questions, I think we could hand it over to Phil to give us his demo. Cool. I'm gonna keep the recording up and you can
But
just share your screen whenever you're ready, Phil.
I was going to say, Julius, do you care if we maybe take like a 15-minute break or something before we do it? I think it might be a little bit longer, but there's just a lot that I'm trying
Okay,
trying
yeah.
to show, and I don't want people feeling trapped or bored.
All right, no problem. Let's all take a 15-minute break and I'll turn the recording back on.